Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the Lexembourg speedrun. I'm recording this one day after the last episode, so there's not much in the way of follow-up, so I think we'll just thank the patrons once again, and then dive right back in. Right, so this time round, I want to focus on possessive classifiers and just coin a few more of those. Because so far we've got 4 of them. We've got the general classifier, the inalienable classifier, the action/accomplishment classifier, and the thoughts or emotions or mental state classifier. And I'd like to get at least a few more, because I think this is one of the branding features of this language, and I kind of want to lean into it to some degree. Again, I don't want to go too crazy, I don't want to do 20 or 30, but somewhere around 10 or so I think would be good. So, in preparation for this, I've actually done a bunch of research. Been reading through all these books and papers, anything I can really find on the topic of possessive classifiers, because honestly there isn't too much data about this outside of the Oceanic languages, because the Oceanic languages are definitely the language family that is most well known for its plethora of possessive classifiers. Eichenwald gives this map. Now, she sorts these possessive classifier systems into 3 different types. There's possessed classifiers, which specify some sort of semantic property of the possessed noun. Then there's possessor classifiers, which obviously specify some property of the possessor, and are evidently extremely rare, because we only have 1 data point here on this map. And elsewhere it's mentioned that possessor classifiers are only known in the Nadahup languages. And then there are relational classifiers, which specify something about the relationship between the possessor and the possessee. Now, with the way that our possessive classifiers are working, seeing as how they evolved from relativized verbs, it seems to me that they would likely all be relational, because they're all basically mini verb phrases that encompass what the subject is doing to the possessed noun. You know, the rock that I have, or the book that I wrote, that kind of thing, which seems to me to be inherently relational. But beyond that, the thing that I really came to appreciate doing this research is just how common it is for possessive classifiers to distinguish edibility. Because I knew that was a thing in the Oceanic languages. I know that Fijian has 3 classifiers, one just sort of general classifier, which basically every language that has possessive classifiers will have one that's just the general catch-all classifier, but Fijian also has a classifier for food and another classifier for drink. And those are the 3 categories in Fijian. And in this paper, which I'll try to put all of these resources in the description, by the way, but in this paper, which is about Raga, I'm assuming that romanization is following the same tradition as Fijian, where what's written with B, D, and G are actually prenasalized. But in Raga, you've got a classifier for food, another classifier for drinks and sweets, but that doesn't include sugarcane, which has its own classifier. I don't know what gets included under the category of sweets. And then there's another classifier for things that are valuable, and then just the general catch-all classifier. And I don't think I'll be able to find it now, but I was looking at Vatlongos as well, which is another Oceanic language that I believe is also spoken in Vanuatu, and it's got a specific classifier just for firewood, and another one that I thought was kind of cool for things that are growing on your land. Like if you have a tree that's growing in your garden, you would use a different classifier for that than you would for any other plant. But the point is, I knew that edibility was an important distinction in the possessive classifiers of the Oceanic languages, but apparently this is something that is cross-linguistically paid attention to in basically every language that uses possessive classifiers. According to this paper, edibility is the primary semantic category that is distinguished in these systems, and all other distinctions are secondary to that. Which surprises me a bit, because I would not have thought that that was a particularly important category to distinguish. But if it is really that universal, then I feel like we should probably have something to do with edibility in the Takvamir system as well. Now, we could just keep it simple, and just use the word that means to eat. So you could say something like, the apple that I eat. And there you go, you've got a class for food. But I might like to do something a little bit more broad, because having a class that's just for edible things feels a little bit restrictive. I mean, obviously it has ample natural precedent, but I might want to do something a little bit more fun than that. And related to that, I was looking through this paper about the possessive classifiers in the Zamucoan languages, and I saw a couple that caught my eye as being quite fun. Like in Aiureo, if that's how that's pronounced, they've got this possessive classifier that's used both for pet animals and vehicles, which apparently comes from a verb that means to breed or rear an animal. Which I guess the connection to vehicles is like you use a domestic animal as a kind of vehicle, if it's a mounted animal. But then there's this one that I really like, where this classifier is used for harvested vegetables, which there's another classifier for other kinds of plants, but also for captured animals and enemies. That's just such a fun spread of nouns. As a noun, it means haul. So I guess it's like all the things that you have gathered in some way. Gather all of your harvested vegetables and haul them to the market, I guess. The same thing with your captured animals. And if you take enemies captive, I guess they're your haul as well. So if we could do that kind of thing with a food classifier, where it's not just food and that's it, that would be really fun. Also, the same language apparently has another classifier that's also used with vehicles, which has a usual meaning of container, which again, that kind of makes sense. And here's the other classifier that refers to non-harvested plants, and it comes directly from the verb that means to plant. And one last one that caught my eye that I thought was really fun, this one here that can be used to mean a fellow or a colleague. It's like, if I were to address all of you as my fellow conlangers, like, I'm not claiming some sort of ownership over you. It's more of a mutual kind of thing, where we're just sort of associated with one another. And one other quick thing I just wanted to point out. This Croft paper mentions that, beyond just edibility, function appears to be the only semantic factor that is involved in possessive classification, and that we don't find distinctions based on animacy, sex, gender, shape, or orientation. Now granted, this paper came out in 1994, and there is data from other papers that contradicts that. Like, I'm fairly certain I saw in one of the Zamucoan languages they have a possessive classifier specifically for long, thin things. But in any case, function definitely does seem to be the primary semantic factor. And a decent example of that is, I was looking at this language, Fera'a, which actually came to my attention during a recent episode of Tongues and Runes, which I'll link to, it's over on the Conlanging channel. And it just so happens that George is also working on a possessive classifier system, and this was one of the languages that was brought up in that conversation. And looking at its possessive classifiers, yet again there's classifiers for to eat and to drink, which, by the way, this is another Oceanic language. But a lot of the other classifiers specifically denote what the possessed noun is used for. Used as a vessel, used as a house, used to sleep or to rest, which is an interesting one. And then the remaining ones are also interesting because you've got generally owned, which again I imagine is just the general catch-all classifier. But then you've got things of customary value versus things that are personally owned. And I wonder how much overlap there is between those, or what situations you would use one over the other. Because what does customary value mean? Anyway, so that's given me a lot of food for thought, and I've written down some of my ideas here. So first of all, there's the whole issue of food and edibility, which I think we're going to come back to later because I haven't thought about how exactly I want to handle that yet. Then I was thinking of having a general associative classifier, kind of like the fellow classifier in the Zamucoan languages, but also a little bit broader than that, because like when you say something like Game of Thrones or At the Mountains of Madness, it's not like the thrones are actually in possession of the game. The game doesn't belong to the thrones. It's more like the game to do with thrones, or the mountains to do with madness. And for a lexical source, I was thinking of maybe some verb of attachment, like tie or bond or join, if you are joined with something. Or maybe to surround or to accompany. If you are surrounded by something, then that's the thing that you're kind of associated with. And I don't know why I've got eat written here. That should be up here with food. And I was thinking maybe a separate classifier specifically for tools, because again, possessive classifier systems seem to be concerned a lot with function, so a verb like to use seems like it would fit well with that. The issue is that I can't really think of a situation in which you would use and you wouldn't use any of the other classifiers. Like if you say, like, I killed the dragon with my sword, you would just say, like, I killed the dragon with the sword that I carry. I guess there could be some overlap, but I don't know, it still doesn't feel quite right to me. Likewise, I was thinking of maybe having a separate classifier for speech or words, because if you wanted to say something like my, well, speech or words or request or command, something like that, none of the other classifiers we have so far quite fit. I guess the action/accomplishment classifier does kind of cover that, because you could say the command that I make or the command that I say. I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence about that. And then for family, we could conceivably have a separate classifier specifically for family members, but I am mindful of the fact that, generally speaking, cross-linguistically, inalienable possession is typically less marked than alienable possession. And that's actually exemplified by the Oceanic languages, because inalienable possession does not involve any classifier. You just stick the genitive ending straight onto the noun. So we could do a similar thing here, where if you have either a family member or some other obviously inalienably possessed thing, then it would be standard for it to occur without a classifier. And we do already have an inalienable classifier, but that could just be used to specify things if necessary, or we could expand its range of meaning to some extent. I do not know. Then I was thinking about classifiers to do with location or spatial proximity, because a fair few of these systems do seem to have classifiers for containers or vessels or something that is held within something else, whether it's a container or a territory, something of that nature. And I thought one pretty decent source for that would be to live or to inhabit. So if you wanted to say my house or my country, it would be the country that I inhabit. And then I was thinking maybe some sort of classifier for animals or livestock or pets, which is another surprisingly common distinction, like that one from the Zamucoan languages that was to breed or rear an animal. I don't want to just straight up steal that, but that is very good. And then I have a note here, I don't think I'm going to do this, but maybe a specific classifier for the substance from which something is made. So you say like a house of brick, or maybe for some sort of just general property of the noun, like a flower of gold or something. I feel like we can cover that with other classifiers though. There probably won't be one specific classifier just for that. And then finally we get back to the issue of value. Something that is owned that is of value. Now, to buy would be a pretty literal source, perhaps a little too literal for my liking. Whereas to own, is pretty obvious. Whereas to get would perhaps imply that you've received the noun. And to sort of go along with that, I was thinking to earn. That really highlights the fact that you've kind of worked for this thing, and therefore it's something that is valuable. And also maybe to reap, which kind of goes back to the whole food thing, just like how in English you can use reap in an expression like to reap what you sow, as in to enjoy the rewards of hard work. So if you reap something, it is something that you have because of hard work, and therefore it's something valuable. Okay, I think I'm actually going to start with the general associative, because I'm pretty sold on that one at this point. Now, the verbs like to tie or bond or join, the issue is that those are pretty similar to the verb that's giving rise to our inalienable classifier, which is to exist with or to co-occur with. So either we just expand the inalienable classifier to also include general association, in which case it wouldn't really be an inalienable classifier anymore, or we go for one of the other options, like surround or to accompany. I kind of like accompany, because it gets across that idea of fellowness that we talked about before, and to make a verb that means to accompany, we could take the verb that means to go, and put a locative applicative on it, to mean to go with, or to go alongside, which is kind of similar to exist with, but it has less of a connotation of being physically associated. It's actually kind of like the English expression to go together. If two things go together, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with going or moving. But I think it's suitably different in meaning that they could exist in parallel with each other, because it would be kind of weird to say something like, my hand that goes with me. Now the interesting thing is, we do have a word that means to go, which comes from an old word that means to run, but up here, we have an older word for to go, that is giving rise to one of our adpositions, and I'd made a note that maybe it only appears in compounds, and this seems like a ripe opportunity to do that. So if we take the word ba, and then with the locative applicative is mi, so the verb stem would be miba, but since there's pretty much always going to be a pronominal prefix, that I would disappear. The classifier would be mba. And I said just last episode that we could use some more MB clusters, so that's pretty serendipitous. Okay, then let me just bash out all of these forms real quick. Okay, so a couple things to note. Number one, the first person inclusive and exclusive are only distinguished by that vowel quality, tamba versus tumba, which I think is fine. But the ones that are giving me pause are the second person plural and the human plural. The second person plural, number one, caramba, just reminds me of ay caramba, which isn't great, but the only other thing I can think of is if the vowel is lost between the R and the M before the M and the B. So it would come out as qurmib, which isn't too much better. And then same with the human plural, especially since the pronominal prefix for the human plural is ar, so really it wouldn't make sense for there to be a vowel there at all. So it would have to be armib, or in fact irmib. And with that one I really don't see any other option. Whereas with this one I think we could justify it either way, and I don't really like either of them. Because it's only 2 syllables, and because I don't want the human plural to be the only form that doesn't have the MB sequence, I'm leaning slightly towards qurmib. I'm going to have to dwell on that for a bit. But other than that, I quite like it. Now the question is, does that verb of to accompany survive into the modern language? I feel like it probably should. So the principal parts would be mivern, mivor, mivas, and simba. Still don't know how I feel about the imperative looking so different to the other forms, but I don't think there's too much that can be done about that at this point. In any case, that's one classifier down. I am wondering if maybe we could use some of these other roots, like tie or bind or join, in some other classifier, maybe? They do have a certain inherent sort of possessive sense to them. Might be able to find some other use for them. But I think the next one we're going to tackle is probably this locational one. So to live or to inhabit, I'm pretty certain we already have a word for that. We do, and it's the general word for to live with another locative applicative applied to it. Now, this is actually making me think. This would be a classifier for places, essentially, including containers, conceivably. In fact, do we have a word for inside? Ah, we do, and it actually comes from this same root. Because I'm just thinking, could we have one classifier for location, or container, and another classifier for contents of a container? Because if you have, like, a glass of water, if you wanted to say, the water's glass, that would literally be the glass that the water inhabits. Whereas if you wanted to say, the water of the glass, I guess you would just use the general classifier for that, because it's like the water that the glass carries. I don't know, maybe one of the other classifiers could kind of encompass that idea as well? Oh well, one at a time. Now, it's interesting that for this postposition, I didn't feel the need to apply the applicative, which I think is okay. It doesn't necessarily need to be transitivized, and plus, postpositions in this language are pretty damn old anyway. But can I use that as a justification for not applying the applicative in the classifier? Because if we do apply the applicative, then that's going to add an M onto the front of that, and then all of the classifiers are going to end up being trisyllabic, which isn't undoable. Classifiers don't necessarily have to be short. Like in Nahuatl, there are several classifiers that are like 3 syllables, like tlamantli, which I think is for long, thin things, but it would be nice if we could keep it shorter. If you're talking about my house, the house that I live in, it really does feel like it needs that applicative, especially since these possessive classifiers aren't actually that old. So with the applicative, the stem would be mihti. So unless we just say that historically, the verb used to just be ambitransitive anyway, that does feel like kind of a cop-out. Is there any other verb we can use? Maybe a verb of posture of some sort, like sit or stand? Now we do have an old word for stand, but that becomes incorporated into the paradigm of the locative copula, so that definitely will not survive into the modern language. we apparently do not yet have a word for to sit, but even if we do use to sit, I think that would still need a locative applicative, because it's like you sit at something. Now, interestingly, I did pick out a couple of forms that I thought would make for some decent classifiers, and this top one happens to begin with an M, which is the form for the locative applicative. So we could say that the stem is aka, and the M is actually the applicative. Yeah, I feel like that might be the way to go, because I'd even preemptively done all of the forms. I'd had this one penciled in for a while. Yeah, it just feels a lot more wieldy than the to live form. So you know what, we're going to go for it. So that'll be our locational classifier, and so that gives us a word for to sit, which I'm imagining will be very semantically weak, and just like in English could be used as just a general expression of location, like the rock sits on the hill, and then with the applicative would mean to be situated or located at something. Cool, so that's 2 more words added to the list. I'm just going to leave this note here about maybe a classifier for the contents of something. Okay, now what? Okay, so I got a little bit stuck and needed to go away and do some thinking for about 20 minutes. So I keep coming back to the food thing. I'm trying to work out where we can incorporate that without having just a straight up food classifier. And the more I think about it, the more I like this idea of reap, or some similar word like to harvest or to gather or something, because that could give rise to a classifier that encompasses both personal possessions, items of value, but also edible plants, which would not otherwise necessarily obviously go together. There's that phrase again, go together. So I think I'm going to roll with that for the time being. Now interestingly, we do already have a verb that means to gather, but that comes from an old word that means to hunt. So if we went with that, then hunted animals or meat would also be included in the same classifier. I'm not sure I actually like that as much though. I think it would be cool if we divided up the edible category, because according to the Croft paper, the primary way that classifiers divide up the edible domain is by manner of ingestion. So eating versus drinking seems to be a pretty common one. It even says the first distinction to appear with non-edibles is valued versus non-valued. Again, this data is primarily taken from the Oceanic languages. So we could just say that there's an older word for to gather, or to reap or harvest, etc. You know, now that I think about it, having a separate classifier for drinks does make some sense to me. Because if you're talking about, like, meat, really there's only one thing that you can do with that. Whereas if you're talking about water, there's plenty of things that you might need to use water for. So you might need to specify, like, is it the water that you're going to use for the crops, or the water that you're going to wash with, or is it the water that you're going to drink? I don't know, maybe there's something in there worth considering. For now, I'm going to stick with this reap idea. Again, we have to consider whether or not this verb survives into the modern language. Because if it comes from a word for to gather, we already have a word for gather in the modern language. I feel like to reap or to gather could develop some other sort of meaning. I guess it could just become a general word for to get or to acquire, because I was thinking of maybe using get for one of these anyway. Yeah, I think that works. I reckon we might as well use this risin form. Once again, the second person plural proves to be the clunkiest form. Qarrri. I think I might just reduce that. Just say that the R's blend into each other. And with the human plural, I think it would technically be arrori with 2 geminate R's, but I'm not going to put up with that. Just say that they collapse together. Another situation with 2 R's down here. Guess I'm going to shorten that one too. I'm starting to think I might need to change the protoform. It does feel a bit like cheating to reduce all those forms, but I like the results, so we've already got 7 classifiers, so I don't think we need too many more. Okay, this is proving to be harder than I thought, because I had to go away for another half hour or so to think about this some more. I was thinking about the one for pets and livestock, and I do like this one from the Zamucoan languages of to breed or to rear, but that does feel pretty specific, other than also being applied to vehicles through metaphorical extension. But I was thinking, what if we used a word that means to trap, or to enclose, or something along those lines? because that would relate back to what we were saying earlier about contents. So if you wanted to say something like, the money in the wallet, you would say the money that the wallet encloses. But that would also make sense for livestock, because with a bit of semantic bleaching, it would just mean the animals that you have within an enclosure. The animals that you keep on your farmstead, for example. That's the only thing I can think of that would make it so that our classifier for pets and livestock had some kind of additional meaning, and could be applied to things other than pets and livestock. But I don't know if I actually like it or not. I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of spinning my wheels a little bit at this point, and this is supposed to be a speedrun after all. So at this point I think I might just coin a phonological form, and then go away and decide which of these two options I prefer, and assign a meaning to the form later based on that. So I had this one other form listed, this nama form, which is fine, but I think I might change it a little bit, because as it is, that would mean that the stem would just be nam for every single person and number. Whereas if we make it gyama, the voiced palatal, the voiced palatal becomes a y intervocalically, and then roticizes everywhere else, which would mean that the forms would look like that. And that will be our 8th classifier, whose meaning is yet to be determined. Yeah, I have plenty to go away and think about at this point. I think in large part, beyond the set that we've created here, a lot of the decisions about how the classifier system is going to work will come up in translation. You know, as we get to the point of translating longer texts, the choice of which classifier to use in which context. But I think for today, that's about as good as we're going to get. Not quite as productive as I was hoping, but we still got 4 new words out of it, so that's good. And depending on how you count, we're either 16 or 25 entries down. So for now, I'm going to go away and think about something other than possessive classifiers, because my mind is absolutely buzzing right now. But I will be back probably tomorrow to record what might be the final part of this Lexember speedrun, which, depending on how I feel, will either be about numerals or just a grab bag of random words, because I did have all of these words here that are on the list to find forms for. So we'll see how it works. But for now, I think I'm going to sign off, and if you have any particular thoughts about the possessive classifiers, do let me know. I could use some more ideas at this point. And other than that, I will see you next time for the 3rd and possibly final part of Lexember.